Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. This is Andrew Stratelates with the Red Pill Religion podcast. Today we have author, lawyer, former programmer, which makes him close to my heart, Nick Soutter. Go ahead and say hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
And we will be discussing.
Hello.
Yep, you're coming in nice and clear. And we will be discussing can we be good without God? So without further ado, let's get into the show. So the first thing I have to ask, Nick, is why did you decide to come on to the Red Pill Religion YouTube channel and discuss this with me?
Yeah, that's not an easy question. As you know, as I think most people know, there was a good deal of pushback against that. I have to say, I think not you, but you guys, the group has had a tendency to say some difficult things, and or some things that are difficult for people to hear and quite firmly disagree with. And I think there's been a lot of it's gotten combative at times, and it's gotten really quite personal at times for a lot of people, including people that I deeply respect, and some friends of mine. And so I'm aware of these facts, and they know I'm aware, which is probably what makes it a little harder for them. So, um, oh, so I'm not. Am I still on? Kind of looks as if I may have been disconnected. I'll keep talking as if I'm connected. I don't know. Um, so let's see. Where was I? I think the people who object have a lot of very good points, and it's a difficult decision to come here. Having said that, and I want to state that I really fully support and appreciate everyone who objected. I can't say they're wrong. I understand their objections, and it's by the dictates of their conscience, and I understand that, and they all have really good points. I can't disagree with any of it. I also very firmly appreciate the people who have supported the decision. For me, it comes down to a couple of things. One of them is that I see a lot of theists, including members of this group, who go out into hostile channels. And by that, I don't mean necessarily that they're hostile and aggressive towards you, although that certainly happens. But ones that aren't necessarily predisposed to your position, and you go out and you engage. And I am thoroughly convinced of my ideas and where I stand, and I think part of that means going out and engaging in discussions with people with whom I have, in many cases, extraordinarily strong disagreements, not just in philosophy, but also in conduct. And I think sitting on the sidelines and yelling about it, uh, even if I've been injured or friends of mine have been injured, isn't necessarily the best way to go about it. Sometimes it's to go on and engage. And I think one of the best examples is shortly after this debate, Apologist Supreme came onto my timeline and said he disagreed with one of my tweets. And I made a small joke back, and then he set me up for a better joke. And it was a deliberate setup. He knew what he was doing because he's got a good sense of humor, it turns out. And so I did another joke, and I said, "Oh my God, you've got a sense of humor." And my response to that actually kind of bugged me, which was my initial response was, "Oh my God, you've got a sense of humor too." Well, of course he does. He's a human being. He was shocked I could tell a good joke. I was shocked he could. But we paused enough to actually tell the joke, and we didn't even engage on that particular tweet that he had objected to. So that's not changing the world, but that tells me that coming on here was, I think, probably a better idea than not. And I am deeply regretful of the people who've been hurt by it. But as I honor and support their firm objections, and I understand why. As I do that, I also have to stand by my own beliefs, which is that coming on to the platforms of people with whom I do have significant disagreements is a worthwhile endeavor if it's done right. And I would encourage, it's not for everybody, but I think it's something that I see theists doing, atheists do as well, but I don't think necessarily quite as much, and I'd like to see more of it. So here I am.
Well, I think that those are very good points, and I commend you for your exemplary virtue and bravery in coming here.
Thanks.
And I don't think you need to be afraid of me, but it requires a sort of bravery to do actions that not everyone agrees with. So thank you, and I deeply appreciate you coming to spend some time chatting about very deep topics here with me.
Well, my pleasure, and I will say this: every discussion and engagement I've had with you guys in regards to this debate has been professional, courteous, and magnanimous. And we've had a few issues where we've had to negotiate a few things, and in each case, you guys were really quite good about those negotiations, which I appreciate. So it's been a positive experience.
Well, you're very welcome. So the topic for tonight is, can we be good without God? And I just would like to sort of get a summary of your thoughts on the answer to that question, and then I'll sort of respond with my answer as well, and we'll go from there.
Well, perfect. Well, my answer is yes, we can be good without God. All right, thanks. It's been great. It was nice meeting you. And I had warned you about this, and I'm going to warn the audience. Every now and then I need to get up and walk about. I have a wireless headset just for that. But so if all of a sudden there's this empty chair there, it's nobody's bailed. I can still talk. It's this disembodied voice of Nicholas Lamar Soutter. I think we can be good without God for a number of reasons. I think we're going to have some significant disagreements, obviously, on how we define good. I think we're going to have disagreements on how we define morality. I think we can sort of deal with those as we get to them. But I think, in my view, God is a construct. It's a construct that works well for a number of things. It can also work well for morality, but there are many constructs for morality. And one of the things is that there's always things that science can't explain and that we don't understand scientifically. But that sort of gap in our knowledge is getting smaller, and it's constantly getting smaller. And one of the things that we've been able to do is really understand where our sense of morality comes from. Now, our actual morality comes both from our sense of morality and how we apply it. Let me rephrase that because that's not entirely accurate. Our morality comes from our innate sense of morality, which we understand now where that comes from, and our values that have sort of evolved in our culture, and that combines to how we operate morally. Now, when the culture includes God, God ends up becoming a part of that equation, but only in that normative sense. I don't think in a meta-ethical sense. I'm going to try to stay away from too many big words, but in a meta-ethical sense, I don't think there's that kind of grounding there. Now, where did we get our sense of morality? You probably see this coming. I'm going to say evolution. How on earth did that happen? How did morality evolve? Well, every species on this planet actually has a sense of morality that is commensurate with its intelligence. So the more intelligent a species is, dolphins, apes, dogs, cats, turtles, the more intelligent it is, the better its sense of morality. Now, the morality may change. Dogs or wolves have a different sense of morality, but within that pack and within that context, they have a sense of morality, and there's a way that you have to operate within that pack. For human beings, one of the reasons we are the dominant species on this planet is because we developed morality, and nature selected for that. You go back to caveman times, a brute term, but best I can do at 9 a.m. or 9 p.m. in the evening. You go back to caveman times, and societies, as they started to form, people realized, hey, my life gets a lot easier if I can work well with others. And then they would form groups. But in order for these groups to operate successfully, they had to have rules that people could follow. People who would violate these rules by stealing, by raping, by any manner of these antisocial activities would get ejected from the group, and their chance of survival would diminish drastically. Meanwhile, anyone who could work within the group would have their chance of survival go up. Therefore, nature is selecting for people who at first simply could at least intellectually realize what they can do to stay in the group. But those who could eventually intuit it succeeded much more. Now, we eventually developed psychopaths, sociopaths, people who were very good at faking it. They had to be smarter in order to survive and in order to fake a sense of morality. But for the rest of us, we developed this intuition, and those of us who were able to follow it were able to work together in a group and had much better chances of survival. We could hunt together. We could have food preparation. If one of us got sick, we could survive because other people were taking care of them. And it was our ability to develop that allowed us to become the dominant species on this planet. So our morality is a huge part of why we are successful. Now, there's also a social element, because I intrinsically really detest the idea of murder. I could probably be conditioned out of it, especially if there's a war or if anything like that. And I can have the societal values will apply on top of certain basic ethical intuitions I have, including, for example, the Golden Rule, which goes back to at least 500 BC. And so society will give me sort of more prescriptive ways of answering my moral intuition. And we develop those, and we grow, and hopefully we get better and more moral societies over time, and society gets more and more successful and healthy. But we do this, and we know to do this because of the values and the moral intuition that nature selected for in us. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a few sentences to sort of gloss and attempt to summarize your perspective. It sounds like you believe that morals are at least partially innate into human biology, and that they came about because they are instrumental to natural success, in the sense that it's what evolution selects for, and that there's this sort of biological root to our morality that then gets filtered through our experience and culture, and that causes some of the variations we see in different societies or different people, and it also explains the commonalities we see with certain things, like stealing from a tribesman is always considered wrong, basically, and that there's this combination of things. And that fundamentally, morality is about pro-social behavior and has been instrumental to our biological success. Did I make any glaring mistakes there?
No glaring mistakes. The only minor tweak I would add is you had said morals, and they're sort of partially biological and partially social. I think that's correct. And the biological aspect isn't morals, but the moral intuition. But you got. I think that's essentially what you meant, and you clarified in a way that you got it. I just so make that minor tweak, but you got it. Thank you.
Sure. So my background is.
I'm gonna interrupt. So I have a very good friend who is watching Sarah, and she's going to see me drinking this energy drink. And don't murder me. It's water. I swapped it out. Sorry. She's watching right now, and I swore to her I would lay off the stuff. And here I am. I drink it because it's got a really nice cap and it works. Please don't murder me. I'm going to get killed as soon as. Can we just keep this going for another 4 or 5 hours? Because I really, as soon as I stop, I'm going to have a. Okay, I'm sorry. I cut you off. Please continue.
That's
I just
okay.
realized.
So my background is in virtue ethics and sort of more of a metaphysical approach. So the question is, can we be good without God, right? And so the first thing that I'll sort of probe into is, what does it mean for a person to be good? And there are lots of different ways to look at this, but the way that I think is correct is that a good person is one that fulfills the nature of a human and is sort of a Homo sapien in the fullest sense, right? Just as a cat that's healthy and has all its limbs and is sleek from eating mice is a good cat, or a big oak tree is a good oak tree. And that type of goodness can be had by an atheist to some extent, right? That the lack of belief in God or disbelief in God doesn't necessarily impinge on your ability to have natural virtues like courage or wisdom or self-control. The issue comes in two things. One is that God as the final cause of things is actually the thing that all of creation is aimed at. And in some sense, everything that is good is actually instantiating what God has made it to be. And then the other question is, if we're made to be in relationship to God, and that's actually the truth of the matter, then being without God prevents you from having that relationship and fulfilling that part of the human nature, right? So I guess one question being raised is man a religious animal, so to speak? And if that is the case, what does it mean to fulfill the religious aspects of human nature?
Oh, that is a great question. Those are two very great questions. I'm sorry, I didn't know if I was interrupting you or if you.
No, I'm done.
Oh, okay. Oh, those are spectacular questions. Is man a religious animal? We seem to have certainly a religious instinct, but well, I shouldn't say a religious instinct. We clearly we would appear to have a religious instinct. I don't know that that means we have one, but we certainly appear to have one. Why? Well, another reason we're the dominant species on this planet is because we're very good at asking questions. What we're not good at is not getting an answer. That we're really bad at. So if we ask a question and there is no answer that we can find immediately, we prefer a made-up answer to no answer at all. And I think that unfortunately undermines our skepticism. It undermines our ability to think critically when we glom onto these, which we simply have done. I think irrefutably we've done a great deal in the past. And I think one of my concerns is, do we have a religious instinct? I don't know if it's a separate instinct from simply our instinct to want to have answers, and in some cases, easy answers. And now, religion isn't necessarily an easy answer. I think if you're going to be truly committed to a religion, obviously, it's not easy. So there's a tremendous amount of study. There's a tremendous amount of commitment. So I don't mean necessarily in that sense, but I would imagine you'd agree that a religion is an easy answer for a large number of people. A large number of Christians are not practicing in perhaps the way that someone might think of when they think of being a really devout Christian. I think a lot of them look to it for sort of easy answers and then go about living the rest of their lives sort of as a quasi or light Christian. And I think that happens in most religions. I think there are some people who get very devoted to it, but I think for most people, it's a way of coping with death, which is terrifying to everybody. It's a way of trying to make sense of things that we don't understand. And I think it's been that way for thousands of years with religion. So I think it makes it look like we have a religious instinct. And I think the social value of religion is really quite important. I think it gives a sense of community. I think it gives a sense of shared values. And so we do instinctively sort of go into religions in many cases, but I don't think that's because it's its own instinct. I think that's just a combination of factors that make it something that appeals to even me in many cases. I lament, not having a church community and a number of other things sometimes. So I do think we have those instincts. So I think I don't know if that answers both questions or neither.
I think it's a start of an answer.
Okay.
These types of things are fractal, right, or recursive. You can go as deep as you can in a human lifetime and still not reach all of the details. But that does raise one question that I will ask you. You said basically that it appears that we have a religious instinct.
Yes.
But that can be explained through the instrumental utility of religion for pro-social activity. Now, that's a gloss, right? But that's
yeah. You're correct on both counts.
Yeah, and in addition to that, we have a tendency to want explanations, and so a combination of not being able to handle no explanation and sort of these epiphenomena, these side effects of religion that are pro-social sort of cause religion to persist, right? And that sounded like the main thrust of it.
It was, yes.
So then the question I have is, can't that be applied to moral intuition as well, right? That in some sense, our moral intuition that comes from natural selection isn't really obligatory that we follow it, but it persists because it has the social benefits or survival benefits, and there's a human tendency to want to fulfill it, just like there's a human tendency to be a lazy overeater, right?
Yes.
Because, in our ancestral environment, being a lazy overeater was the optimal strategy for
I wouldn't know what you're talking about. I got no idea what you're talking about, but I will. Oh, is the camera back on? Never mind.
So I guess that would be the question I would ask is, if this is just sort of side effects that cause this to persist, and that there's no like obligatory force to fulfill our religious instinct, then why is there any obligatory force to fulfill our moral instinct or our moral intuition?
There isn't one.
Okay, so then in that case, in what sense, and this is going to be a semantic question, is one way to look at morals or ethics is morals explains what is obligatory for a person to do, right? And if the moral intuition we have isn't obligatory, it's not obligatory to follow it, then in what sense is that a grounding of morality?
I think that's a very good question. I think I think you're right, where we're going to get into semantics, and I think we're going to start to get into, I think, the difference between sort of normative ethics and something meta-ethical. But one of the things was I did, and obviously a dictionary is not prescriptive, but I think it is a very good tool for trying to understand how we use words and how people in general use words. Obviously, there are exceptions to it, but I think it gives us a pretty good idea. And one of the things I did was I went through 7 dictionaries, including Collins, Webster's, Oxford, Macmillan, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and the Cambridge Dictionary. And I looked up words objective, good, righteous, what else? Morality, So we're talking about the word morality. One of the reasons I had to look up all these words is because you're right, it gets fractal pretty quickly. And morality, he could only talk about morality in terms of these other words. So morality, a doctrine or system of moral conduct, conformity to ideals of right human conduct. But then it starts getting into principles of right or wrong behavior. So now I got to look up right or wrong, and then looked up a whole bunch of words sort of associated to this. And I found one interesting thing, which is the word grounded and objective wasn't in any of them, in any of the dictionaries, in any of the words applying to morality, which includes whether something is good, bad, right, wrong. 7 dictionaries, including Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I couldn't find the word objective in any of them, and I couldn't find grounding in any of them. So I think we can get into a discussion of grounding. I think it's an important discussion to have, but it seems to me that in the common everyday usage of the language, it's not something that people actually need or think about as a grounded or absolute objective truth. And in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that wasn't a requirement for it either. So I think if we want to start talking about, is there a metaphysical grounding of some kind, we can do that, but I don't see that there is any kind of acceptance, either in philosophy or in common usage, that morality has to be grounded that way in order to work.
Well, and so this actually gets into, I think, a more interesting part of it, which is what does it mean for morality to work, right? So,
Yes.
this is one ethical system I'll just describe as contrast. I don't think that this is exactly what you subscribe to, but if it is, you can let me know. I just will use it because it's very different than how I look at things. Is what's sometimes called preference utilitarianism, right? That the moral actions or the moral choices are the ones that allow the most people to fulfill their preferences, in some sense. And there are all sorts of weighting schemes and stuff like that. And the issue that this runs into, for me at least, is that the choice of what preferences to have itself seems to be a moral question.
I'm not sure if it's a moral question, but I think it can become one. So I don't think it's necessarily a moral question. So I'm gonna just clarify a touch here. I don't think it's necessarily a moral question, but because it can become one, I think you are correct. I think it needs to be addressed because it can become one. Presumably, someone's going to prefer. Well, no, I mean, preferences can go either by taste or they can go by, but morality is going to probably play a role. So it's enough that you're right. So, were you going to say something? Or?
No, I'm just waiting.
So, when you sort of do a survey of the basic normative ethical systems, there isn't any of them that doesn't have a significant problem. Now, what you're talking about here is a almost I don't want to say a problem of induction, but the sort of the Hume's problem of induction, where you can't answer without begging the question, which is essentially what you're saying. You need to have a morality already to actually apply the ethical system of preference utility. That's absolutely true, and that I have found it is true of every ethical system, deontology, any kind of consequentialism, moral realism, moral relativism, anything like that. You're going to have some kind of problem that usually ends up with begging the question. But the thing that I have found is that also applies in religious morality. Because now in religious morality, there's an ontological argument that tries to get around this, where you define a higher power into existence such that you can say, okay, we are going to ground in a metaphysical supreme being And that being either through divine command theory or just some kind of tautology is that being is our objective grounding. But that in and of itself is actually the ontological argument, because what you're doing in that case is you're trying to define an objective morality into being. And you can't do that also, well, depends on, there are two ways to do it, but one of them's begging the question, and the other one I think goes into an infinite regress. In either case, the way I see it is, even though it would appear to the religious that they have this grounding because you have God, that's the grounding. That's only true, really, if God exists. And I think I would argue that the belief in God is a subjective belief, and that it's nothing more than the ontological argument for God when that belief is tried to be made objective, and when what you're essentially doing is trying to take a normative system and create a meta-ethical system from it, when in fact, presumably, if you could create a normative system from a meta-ethical system, that's the order it would go in.
So, just to summarize very pithily, you basically say that theistic systems of morality rely on sort of God's existence as an axiom to sort of prove the obligation of morals or ethical laws, or in the sense that you have to take it as a package, right? That if you're going to follow like Aristotelian theistic morality, you're also going to have as a package of those coherent beliefs a belief in God, and that there's not really a foundationalism between them, but there's a coherence between them. Is that an okay summary, or am I way off?
No, you got it.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree that that's an important point. That, and this is actually true of any sufficiently sophisticated philosophical system, that there are assumptions or starting points within the system that cannot be supported by the system itself, right? And this is what Gödel's incompleteness theorem is about, and other things, that in some sense there is an existential subjective choice of what tools are you going to use, or what assumptions are you going to make, right? And the classical one is the fight between what were broadly called the dogmatists and the skeptics, where the dogmatists believed that in theory our perception of reality actually conformed to reality, and the skeptics either denied that or weren't willing to assent to that, and then they spread out into these very different systems, and I think that's a very good point, that there has to these things come as a package, and that in some sense you can't deductively get from a starting point without that existential leap. The only other point that I would make, and this might be a semantic issue, is if we are trying to describe a moral system that has like moral obligations, then the thing that grounds the thing that produced those things, in some sense, has to have, I'll call it, spiritual significance, not in the sense of necessarily being like an ancient religion, but it has to relate to the type of actions people take in the world, with the world as an arena for action as opposed to a world of objects to analyze. And in that sense, I think that you eventually have to have something that is either sacred or takes the role of something sacred.
I think that's an interesting observation. I would be curious as to how one would define sacred and what could work with that. Utilitarian models I particularly like. They're not. They've got their issues, but I am a consequentialism basic sort of utilitarian models. One of the things that they really sort of have to take on assumption is that for some reason it's better to have an outcome that everybody, that's best for everybody, including yourself, and that sort of is a rising tide lifts all boats, and if everybody does the best for everybody, it works out great. Well, the thing is, that's still an assumption, and what I would argue is that while I have these objections that I mentioned about religious systems and how they have to make these untenable assumptions, so does Sam Harris.
Yeah.
And Sam Harris sort of says, no, this is objective. Well, it's objective within the framework. It's objective in a normative sense, but he has to make a whole bunch of assumptions to get that framework to work, including one that, and I've had this discussion with people. They're like, well, no, it's objective that, what's best for everybody is good. Well, no, we might all agree on it. It might be that if you were to take 1,000 people, all 1,000 would agree on it. That doesn't make it objective, and that's not actually an objective grounding in a meta-ethical sense. It doesn't get you there. So when we talk about what is this grounding that you're looking for, I think, assuming I'm not off track myself, I will tell you, or no, yeah, that's sort of what you said, I think. I don't know if I'd necessarily call it spiritual, and you allowed for the fact it wasn't necessarily spiritual in the common usage of the term. If you're going to be a utilitarian, and you're going to end up having to do this, I agree with you, with every one of these systems. If you're going to be a utilitarian, you're going to have to take in as an assumption, and it seems like a safe assumption. It is a safe assumption for most intents and purposes, but in a meta-ethical sense, it's an assumption. It's not objective. But what you're going to do is you're going to take and say, really, what's sort of best for everybody, myself included, is the right thing to do. But I don't think there's a very easy way to, or if it's even possible, to ground much further than that. And I don't see Sam Harris succeeding in that. I don't see almost anybody. I've never seen a system of ethics that I think, and that includes, again, religion, any religious system. I don't see them succeeding in that metaphysical grounding. And so what that would mean, and just to quickly try to bring it back to the topic of the debate about being good without God, my argument would be you can be good with God and good inside the normative framework that includes God, but there would also be good inside a utilitarian framework or inside any of these other frameworks. If you're looking for a good that would apply across the board, that could be applied in a metaphysical sense, I don't think that exists. I certainly don't see any evidence for it, and every system that I've looked at fails when it attempts to achieve it, unless it is doing something like either some kind of a sort of sleight of hand with with equivocation over semantics, or an ontological argument for God, for a system like that, which would imply trying to define such a meta-ethical system into existence.
Yeah. So. And I'll try to make 3 points real sort of quickly. Is that I think what I'm trying to say when I say the sacred thing, the thing that your actions are in accord with that thing being of incomparably high value, right? So for certain types of utilitarianism, maximizing the benefit to everyone in some sense is sacred, right? Because you're acting as though that is the thing within care that is the most value. And Sam Harris does the same thing with his system, and so on and so forth. So one way out of this sort of grounding problem and this is actually roughly how the Stoics and some of the Greeks looked at it, is that if we can understand the metaphysical substrate of reality, then that means that properly trained human minds are able to perceive these types of things. And that if we all put our heads together and discuss it and observe and train ourselves and try really, really hard, we can come pretty close. And that's sort of the Stoics had some, they call them axioms, but they thought that through self-reflection and analysis you could see that they were clearly true, like virtue is the greatest good, that virtue makes all other things good, and that if you don't have perfect virtue, then everything else doesn't matter, and so on and so forth. We won't get into that too much, but and basically they thought that this was by using reason and our intuitions and the environment, we were able to come to these conclusions. And I guess the third one, and you might consider it sort of semantic equivocation, but the thing that is common about what I believe good is, what you believe good is, and Sam Harris believe is good, is in the sort of Aristotelian or Thomistic sense, being itself. That existence or the being, the instantiation of reality itself in as many people as possible to the greatest extent possible is what good is, and that it's actually the actualization of potential. And that's how I would articulate it. I don't know if you would agree with that or think that that's a philosophical sleight of hand, but that would be my first swing at it.
No, I don't think that's unfair, and I certainly don't think it's necessarily sleight of hand. With one caveat that we have to sort of understand, which is even that is within a normative framework. To jump from there to a meta-ethical framework, I don't think has been done by any of these systems. Now, I think this, sort of, I think you're right about these virtues. I think the only reason we call them virtues is because, again, that has been ingrained into us by our DNA, by our evolution, by how we got to be. Nature selected for us to have that. And I think this also gets into, what do we do when religion has one explanation for things, and or not just religion, but there's a sort of a dogmatic, well, gee, is there a meta-ethical good out there, the Greeks that you were talking about? Is there something we can find, versus a scientific explanation which describes how we got to where we are in our beliefs? I think in my mind, you have to go with the scientific explanation if it's well-founded and grounded, and I think this is.
Yeah, and so what I would say to that is, and it's sort of fascinating because the way that the Stoics use their language is they were interested in a couple different ways. One is they used words very jargony, in a very jargon-like way. Two, they were notorious for having very pithy and simple, short answers. And three, they were really good at irritating skeptics. And basically, they were asked, summarize what it means to be good. And they said, live according to nature. And the interesting part to sort of investigate is, you say that our morals are what nature selected, and we're using nature in different terms, right? One is sort of providential, and the other is that which selects in a Darwinian sense. But there's the potential, and I'm sort of this school because I tend towards theistic evolution, that this naming doesn't necessarily mean that they're in conflict. That what nature selects is actually what gave us our morality. It's just that nature is a capital N nature that has like moral obligatory force after it, rather than just a random process that doesn't necessarily have any more moral force than what we decide we want to have moral force with it.
I'm going to be honest with you. I prefer your view. I greatly prefer your view. I get into it with atheists all the time who say, "Well, gee, I'm glad there's no God. I'm glad there's no higher power. I'm glad there's nothing driving I'm not. I would want to see my kids again after I die. I would want to imagine that I've got a soul and a higher purpose. These are things I really want. I want them, I think, for a number of reasons. Again, we've covered some of them. I also think it's a spectacular appeal to ego. When you take a look at a galaxy that's 14 billion light years across, the notion that there's the creator of that, it knows you and is keenly interested in you is a tremendous appeal to ego. I like the idea that there would be an objective one, that an objective value out there and an objective nature that in some way gives us a meta-ethical grounding for these values. I simply don't see either a need for it in the sense of, and so when we're talking about ethics, all the ethics that we have, or at least that can be demonstrated, can be understood within the systems that we have and use. And Occam's razor would suggest that we do not multiply unnecessary causes into it. And God would strike me as an unnecessary cause, because I don't see anything that concept contributes. It does create a different, as you had said, sort of internally consistent meta-ethical model that you can follow, and is probably no less valid than, well, depending on a couple of factors, I suppose, but is arguably no less valid than Sam Harris's model. But I don't see it being superior either.
Well, I'll just respond. The key thing is that even under the theistic evolution, there's this moral obligation that you say does not exist under the naturalist framework, right? That there is no obligation to follow the moral intuition, but we tend to do it because it's how we've survived. And I think that's the sort of the key point, and the key difference that we have is that the moral obligation in the systems I understand comes from God himself, and there's some semantic issues, right? Because what is God, and is God goodness itself, so on and so forth. And that seems to be missing, at least partially, right? I totally agree that someone under a naturalistic system can look at our evolved nature and say, yes, this is what the moral intuition filtered through culture and experience says, and I'm going to choose to do that. But there's not that, and maybe we need to unpack what moral obligation is, but there's not that explicit participation in the metaphysical reality, is, I guess, the way that I would articulate it.
Well, so I would agree with how you framed the all the other views except for yours, if you understand what I'm saying. So I would agree. You're right. There's no that grounding. It does not exist in the views that I've been espousing or talking about. But if what I understand, if I understand you correctly, which is essentially, I'm going to phrase it slightly differently, but that there is no objective. Now, when I say objective, I don't mean objective in the scientific sense, which is to say that we all agree with it, but objective in the philosophical sense, which is to say that it exists outside of our minds in some way, even if none of us agree with it. So there, in that sense, in your model, there is an objective morality outside the normative values, which is either divine command theory or some kind of denotology, if I understand correctly. And I just want to, now I'm trying to reframe you or rephrase you.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the systems that I've been espousing, none of that exists. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, and divine command theory. There are versions of divine command theory that are very low resolution. My system you can look at as a sort of sense of divine command theory, but it's requires the understanding that by following the divine commands, you are actually participating in the divine itself. And to put that in secular language, by following the right normative forms, you are actually participating in what brings value, the absolute value to life. And this comes into questions of nominalism too, right? And meaning. And my sort of view is that meaning is something that, by analogy, is relationship between minds, right? We're having a meaningful conversation right now because I think, and then I turn it into symbols, and then transmit it, and then you interpret the symbols and are able to understand it. And the question is whether the life or reality as sort of that arena for action has that sort of meaning, or if that's just something that we're imparting onto it. We might be getting far afield, but this is sort of, I guess, the key point is that the ontologies that we affirm have effects not only on our ethical systems and our understanding of what meaning is.
I think that's unavoidable and absolutely correct. So let me ask and sort of rephrase it in a slightly different way. So I think, and I'm just going to, so when you say meaning that way, I'm going to say meaning in a metaphysical sense, so something outside of what we can really make for ourselves by any of these other systems that we've been talking about. It would seem to me that essentially what you're proposing, and we don't have to, I know that you may have a preference for the God of Abraham, but we don't need to necessarily just sort of any metaphysical higher power could sort of fill that role. So it's I think the view that you're arguing is we sort of would need that in order to have a higher meaning. And that you cannot get that higher meaning from these other systems that I've been discussing. I think is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and we can detail it out that, there of course can be the highest meaning for a human life or the highest meaning in human history, but that's different, at least linguistically and from my perspective ontologically, than like eternal meaning, right? So and to sort of illustrate it with the point, let's imagine that the earth gets invaded by evil aliens, right? And there is a man that gets kidnapped, and he wakes up, and if he like pulls out the wires in their engine room or whatever, it destroys the mothership and saves humanity. But they kidnapped him in secret, and the only person that knows about it is him himself. And then the question is, where does that exist, right? And sort of in the nominalist understanding, my understanding is that only exists in his mind while he's still alive, and then once he makes that sacrifice, that sort of disappears from the universe. And then from like a theistic understanding, even something like Stoicism or deism or whatever, that choice and action that he took has some sort of eternal significance through the participation in this like metaphysical reality.
All right. I think I understand that view. So I guess a few things at one point, and now I may have missed it, so I'll keep an eye out for it. I'll try to. It sounded like what you had said was, well, we would get this meaning from this metaphysical system, and the reason that we need this metaphysical system is because we get the meaning from it. And that sounded circular to me, but I think I may not
Right.
have.
Yeah. Let me break that down a little bit.
I want to get in one other point because I'll forget the other point,
Please.
and then and then the other thing is, there's a saying, the thing about the universe is it has a stubborn refusal to conform to what I wish were true. Again, I'd like there to be a higher meaning, but that doesn't necessarily make it true, and my discomfort with that doesn't necessarily, I'm not comforted by a lot of things, and there are a lot of intuitions we have or things that would like to be true and would make it easier to understand the universe, but that doesn't mean that they're true. So I guess what I would ask on top of that question that I just did, let's assume that, so there's really two models here of your view of a metaphysical being that gives us good and gives us that higher sense of eternal existence. In my view, everything you're saying is actually normative. It is not meta-ethical. You believe it's meta-ethical, and you're saying, well, our normative system comes from this meta-ethical grounding. And in my view, that claim is actually, it's still part of your grounding, absolutely, but it's still grounding within your normative framework. So I can look at your entire view and say, your framework has this supposition of a God, but that God does not actually exist in that metaphysical sense that you claim, and therefore it's still just part of your normative framework. So my second question would be, we have two models of your view. Your model, where there is that separate metaphysical entity, and my view, where you claim it, but that claim itself is part of the normative grounding, and that entity isn't there. Given those two views, how would one distinguish and say, I can assert or understand one of these views to be correct and the other one not?
Okay, so I'll try to unpack the meaning question first, and then we'll get into how do we select whether or not God is true in a non-circular way, if that's even possible. So meaning is something that everyone experiences regardless of the metaphysical system that they affirm, right? Do you have meaning in your life when you do certain things, just as I do, even though we have very different explanations for why that occurs, right? And roughly it sounds like you would basically say that meaning is this mental state that occurs because nature has selected for it, and it has instrumental utility to the propagation of the species. Maybe.
Correct.
Okay.
Roughly, you got it.
Yeah, and I would say that meaning is what happens when you act in accord with God, right? And
Yes.
and so the physical reality of it, in some sense, is the same for both of us. That we experience meaning. The question is, what type of meaning is this related to, right? And so, in my system, that meaning has a family resemblance to language, to stories, to these other things that are occurring, and not just in the sense that they're human behaviors, but in sort of the sense that there's like almost a mathematical connection between them. And it sounds to me like you're using the sense of a meaningful life doesn't necessarily have the same type of connection to like the meaning of a story or those types of things, and that they might be associated because there's this shadow of the same mechanism in our mind, but that might be accidental, and that our association of this meaning of stories versus the meaning of a meaningful life it could be accidental, or could be just a quirk of evolution.
Mine's a lot less romantic, yes.
Yeah. So then the question is, if that's the case, what's the reasonable action to take? Is it reasonable to act as though these things have a metaphysical reality, just like is it reasonable to eat cheesecake because that's what our evolved digestive system and things says is most pleasurable, or is there's something else going on that we have to keep in mind? Because we have the ability to override evolution, right? Just because, for example, I was born with a genetic tendency towards asthma, there's no reason why I should allow that to be what I should be, right? So, I take medication and do all these things to correct it. And then that's sort of the question here too, is that if that is sort of the same type of thing as a meaningful life, why shouldn't we, for example, modify our nature so that we find banal things meaningful?
That's a very good question. The answer I would give is that it's been my experience, and I think most people would agree, and this is a largely subjective as well, but it's been my experience that false beliefs cause a phenomenal amount of damage. And I think it's very rare that we really sit down and consider what false belief has done. But believing in something either because it comforts us or because it gives us meaning, and for that reason. Now, I can make a mistake and I can do something really terrible and wrong, whether I have true beliefs or not. But the likelihood that I'm going to do something severely wrong goes up dramatically when I believe in things that simply are not true. Now, this could be anything from believing that the earth is flat to believing that one gender or race is inferior to another, or believing that whatever the belief is. And indeed, whether we agree it's true or not, there have certainly been many gods of one kind or another, which you and I would probably agree have been false beliefs and just tremendous, terrible acts done in the name of that and in the name of giving meaning. We sacrifice a virgin because that gives us meaning and helps us to commune with this power that we think is there, whether it's, whether we're communing with Quetzalcoatl or whichever person we're sacrificing said virgin to. And that's not even to speak of what we do with people who start to challenge those beliefs. So the meaning is so important to us. And I agree, we have this desire for it. It's so important to us that we would actually murder people who find ways to challenge it. Galileo made two mistakes. Aside from his discoveries, he was actually told he could publish his discoveries. His real problem was he published them in Italian instead of Latin. If he had published them in Latin, only the church and highly educated people could read it. It was when he started showing other people that, look, these things aren't necessarily the way we think they are. People said, well, you can't take that. And part of it was also just about power. It was, the church didn't want to lose power. But the other part of it was, and the reason people, the Salem witch trials, it's about, people were losing that sense of grounding. Doesn't mean the grounding was real. It doesn't, but it certainly affirms the fact that we do have a need for it. Getting back to sort of Nietzsche's, if God was not real, we would invent him.
So you have several false beliefs there. Do you want
I always have false beliefs.
Yes. Well, do you want them to be corrected?
Always.
Okay. So the first question is, are there actions in life that have significant value asymmetries based on whether you do them or not?
Are there actions in life? I'm sorry.
Sure. So is a cost are there situations in life where the cost of a mistake is significantly more magnitude than the benefit of being right?
I would be able to give an answer, but that answer would be my personal subjective value on it. My answer would be yes, there are,
Mm-hmm.
and that would actually appear to undermine the argument I just made. But I will also add that that is still nonetheless my subjective value, and there are people who would not agree with that. I do think that they also have a tendency to cause more trouble than not, but that's how that gets into virtue ethics. But
Yeah,
yes, the short answer is yes.
yeah, and I mean the concrete example is, would anyone wise play Russian roulette for $1 million?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
yeah, or
I'm not sure I'd agree with that example, but I do know what you're saying. I think I know what you're saying, which is
uh,
would I be willing to sacrifice? Would I be willing to have a false belief if, or obviously that's circular too, but you know what I'm saying in a just a hypothetical way, would I be willing to have a false belief if by having that false belief I could do far more good than by not doing it, or I could prevent a significant harm by not doing it? And my
yeah,
answer to that is yes.
yeah. Okay. So and so this is actually one difference that we have is that I'm actually closer to your original view, that I think there's a moral obligation to believe true things, and that's actually what obliges me to be religious, because I believe it to be true. And so we're going to detail a few of the anecdotes that you gave, just so that, and we won't be able to get into too much detail, but the viewers and listeners at home can look into it too. One is with sacrifice, and especially human sacrifice in pagan or societies, both in the Near East and in civil and like Central America. Generally, all the systems of human sacrifice that I know of were basically based on manipulating supernatural forces. So they weren't aiming to commune with Quetzalcoatl. They were aiming to get Quetzalcoatl to do something for them, and they were trying to basically influence, if you're being polite, or manipulate, if you're not, the gods to show them favor.
Yes.
And so the idea of communing with the higher plane or stuff like that does have a natural tendency in human cultures, but they tend to come out in things like prayer or trances or dance or even the use of hallucinogenics. And so this desire to commune with meaning does have a tendency in various cultures, but it tends to be in something that is not so obviously destructive as like human sacrifice is.
Let me interrupt real quick. I think you're right. And that's a very good point, and you are absolutely correct in why those sacrifices were made. That's true. I was using commune in a somewhat broader sense, which was they were trying to speak to Quetzalcoatl. It was for favor, so you are absolutely correct. It is not commune in the same sense as prayer. I agree, and that's a very good point. They were trying to influence them. There is no examples I can think of either where it was done in the sense that you're using it. That is true. I use commune in a slightly different way, and either I was being indelicate with my language, but we can get into that. But I wanted to.
Sure, yeah, and I really appreciate you opening yourself up to uh, basically me pointing out what I think are errors. So thank you. And then the third point is, Galileo, and the top spot does this. It's called the Great Tamalic Smackdown, where he does a great analysis of what happened with Galileo. And basically, as far as like conflicting with church authority, the issue that he ran into is that he wanted the church. Well, one, he got in a fight with the Pope, which just made everyone impatient, and two, he actually wanted the Roman Catholic Church to claim that his theory was grounded in Scripture. And the church basically said, well, no, it isn't grounded in Scripture. There are other theories that could happen too. And Galileo is sort of one of my pet humbugs or whatever, that there was injustice done to him, but it wasn't because of scientific theories. It was basically because of the human aspects of it. And of course, the other great example is Johann Kepler, who, from the Roman Catholic perspective, was literally a heretic. And he actually posted things that were much more detailed than Galileo in the science. But he was totally left alone because he knew how to not make waves, basically. And then, go ahead.
No, I think actually all of those are good points. I think Galileo, it's very easy to, especially for an atheist, to just sit there and say, okay, it was because he was espousing knowledge. He was a bit of a troublemaker as well, and not just in this. I mean, he was. There were a lot of other factors, political factors. And it may also, maybe if you want to send me the link to that, maybe I can learn something. And so I think that is also a good point. And I would have one more I'll add, but I'd like you to finish.
Sure. And then finally, with the Salem witch trials, sadly the issue there wasn't that the witches were a threat to their sense of meaning, but that they basically constructed. And there are two schools of thought that I think have reasonable effect. One is that there's the potential that there was some like use of hallucinogenic funguses that was occurring. The other is that it seems pretty obvious that there were political ramifications in the witch trials, because they tended to be older women who had a lot of wealth but no known heirs. So it tended to be that if they were executed or imprisoned, their sizable wealth would go to the city council, basically. And that basically it wasn't coming to meaning, but the human tendency to use whatever system they can to do wrong. And I mean, there are similar things in atheistic societies too, or even just
You don't say.
or even plural societies. Yeah, humans suck everywhere, and humans are good everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a that's a very fair point. Well, so I'd like to make two quick points. So let me make one other one, an example of where I think what I believe to be a false belief has caused just a phenomenal amount of damage. And then I'd like to revisit an issue that we didn't hit, and I would like to see if we can cover. So the first is, in 1990, Pope John Paul II decided he was going to convert the entire continent of Africa. This is one of the most successful Catholic missions just in history. And he, I mean, this has been wildly successful for the Catholic Church. One of the things is that Catholics banned the use of condoms. Now, at the time, Africa had an AIDS rate of 2%. This was the same AIDS rate that you could find anywhere in the world. Now, Africa has an AIDS rate of 46%, and it consists of, or 68% of all AIDS cases are in Africa. They have a tremendous overpopulation problem that they can't feed. This is causing mass starvation of, I think it's, well, it's at least one child every 17 seconds starves to, no, actually it's not 17, it's 7 seconds, starves to death. And what happens is you get parents who get AIDS, the parents die, the children are unable to fend for themselves. You have, again, overpopulation. And a lot of this, there are other factors, but one of the biggest factors is the church's prohibition on the use of condoms and their very strong and successful advocacy with, for example, George W. Bush on not funding medical assistance that included condoms or sexual education, which every study we have says if you want to stop the spread of disease and if you want to stop teen pregnancy, condoms are the best way to do it. Now, if he is correct that God does not want us to use condoms, then presumably he's done something moral and correct. But if he's wrong, which the Catholic Church has on occasion admitted to being wrong on issues similar to this, and the Catholic Church is constantly evolving. If he's wrong, this false belief has caused just a tremendous amount of suffering. So that's the first example I'll give of a false belief that I think can be extraordinarily problematic. And the other question is, I did want to see if we could get back to, I had said, okay, let's assume your framework of God, but your belief in God, in a metaphysical God, but under the two views. Your view, where God is actually a metaphysical existence and can ground morality, and my view, where your position on God is still actually part of your normative ethics. And given those two views, how would one distinguish which one is there any objective way to say, oh, one view is in fact correct and the other one is not?
Sure. And it's sort of funny you bring up African AIDS. This is actually another one of my pet things. I actually, for a very long time, supported a orphanage that aimed specifically at AIDS orphans in Africa. So, there's an entire thing of the Roman Catholics and condoms that I won't get into, but just for the framing, the issue in Africa, there is basically two issues. One, in Africa, culturally, it's a lot more accepted for people to have basically long-term non-monogamous relationships. So you'll have a couple, and both of them will then have a person on the side. And what happens culturally is, as these romantic relationships actually cultivate and grow, the use of condoms ends. So the first few times that they have sex, they'll have condoms, and then they'll stop. And this is very different than the way that sexual activity occurs in both places like Europe and North America, and even like prostitution in Thailand. The likelihood of someone who is sexually active in Africa getting AIDS is significantly higher than even of a prostitute in Thailand. And it's basically because of this cultural acceptance of having people on the side and the cultural use of condom-free sex as sort of a symbol of trust. And the issue, of course, is that they shouldn't do either of those things. And that's the fundamental thing that's happening in Africa, and that's sort of the key part. But to get on to the grounding issue, so this is a good question, or a good point, is that, so it sort of reminds me of a Pyrrhonian skeptic and a Stoic sort of run into the same thing. A Stoic says, here are the virtues, knowledge can be had, and here are the things that I know. And the Pyrrhonian skeptic, who doesn't claim anything, he says, okay, you believe all of those things, but how do you know that to be the case? It could be very well be the case that your perceptions and sense impressions of the world have nothing to do with the world, and therefore your entire system is basically built on straw. And the same is true of my system, right? That I have to make some assumptions, right? I have to make the assumption that in the right environment, when my cognitive faculties are properly behaving, I will make true beliefs. And not only that, that the environment that we're currently in is sufficiently like the one that is needed to form true beliefs for me to form true beliefs. And if that's not the case, then in some sense, all systems are equal, right? And that you have to make an existential jump to one or another. And that that might not be a satisfying answer, but it's the best one I got at hand. So.
All right. Well, I mean, on some level, it seems to me that everyone has to make those assumptions that they would be properly basic beliefs that are sort of what is it? The word isn't required. Well, those that would be properly basic or necessarily basic beliefs. Now, I don't see how that requirement is different from any other system. And again, it seems to me that what's happening here is essentially a violation of Occam's razor, which is that you are, in order to at least, declare that there is a higher objective moral power, you're adding more than can be either demonstrated or than is even necessary, given that it seems to me that your system is actually still on equal grounds with everybody else's.
Well, so let's look at that criticism. That basically, you're saying that my system does not explain any more than anyone else's, and it's more complex.
The more complex would be an unfair criticism of your system, but for the fact that your system is attempting to make that metaphysical jump.
Okay, so okay, well, and I guess that's sort of the question, right? Is metaphysics real? And if it isn't, then there's not in my opinion, and I think this is correct, there isn't a unifying substrate to connect things like epistemology and ethics and ontology and how reason works together. And this is sort of a aesthetic argument or thrust that having a unifying theory that has elegance is worth a little bit of more claims, because we're actually we're elaborating the system. And so for it to be a little more complex is fine, because it provides more connections between these things in a way that is in accord, I think, with truth.
Well, yeah, that's, first of all, the I think is a bit of an issue, and also elegance in and of itself is not a reason. If it's necessary, then yes, you can add it. But elegance in and of itself is not a reason to add it. But you had said, that the way you actually phrased my position somewhat better than I've been doing, which is sort of, in my view, is there almost is no such thing as meta ethics. So I think that's actually a very good way to frame it. So let's assume for a second that that's exactly the thing I'm arguing, and that what I'm suggesting is that there is none. Now, how would you be able to differentiate and demonstrate that your system actually does have a meta-ethical system, as opposed to is what I claim, which is just a normative system that makes the claim of a meta-ethical grounding?
Okay, well, there are two questions, right? One is, well, I guess it depends on how reasonable is it to compare normative ethical beliefs or ethical systems. If it's totally unreasonable to compare normative ethical systems, then that would be in accord with meta-ethics not existing. And if it is reasonable, at least to some extent, that would be more in accord with a meta-ethical system being actual or being real.
Sort of. I think I see where you're going, and I think that's an excellent point. But as I had said before, I think the ethics that that we have and the morality that we have applies on top of our natural instinct to try to get a morality. So I think I agree with you that, and I see the principle. I mean, how on earth could I claim one normative system is better than another if I'm not assuming a meta-ethical standard by which to judge it? That's makes perfect sense. But if I actually have a moral intuition already that I can use to try to judge it, and I can bring my experience into it, and this is similar to almost one of the things I've noticed is people don't, religion doesn't choose the people who follow it. The people choose their religion. And in fact, they already apply whatever ethical standards they have to. So if you're sitting here and you're saying, I'm a Catholic, but wow, I don't like where the Catholic Church is heading, you become a Protestant, or you become a Baptist, or you become something else. Now, how did you have that instinct to change the religion? And to presumably, as you've been told by the members or the orders of that religion, to violate their instructions and say, no, I think it's something else. By the same method by which you can do that, you can sit there and say, utilitarianism doesn't work for me for the following reasons. And I'm not trying to say that there are objective reasons that require a metaphysics. I'm trying to say that there are reasons that apply to me.
Well, that's true to some extent, but then the opposite occurs as well. My moral beliefs have actually been significantly formed by the religion I joined in my adult life, and it wasn't exactly it wasn't my intuition that was guiding me. It was rather the other way around, that I was forming my moral intuition based on this higher level abstraction. And so that's the question too, is that not only can we say that certain normative systems are better or worse, we can actually say that certain human intuitions about action are better or worse, and that and actually aim to form them through training and exposure and behavior. So it doesn't seem to me that biology is a sufficient ground to it if we're going to make not only a comparison of normative ethics, but ethical training systems as well.
All right, I am starting to get a little tired, so how do you say about maybe 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes?
Sure. Let's go ahead and capstone it, and we'll try to summarize the main thrust of our points. I'll go ahead and go first, and let you have the last word.
Oh, all right.
So basically, this has been a wonderful discussion, Nick. I really appreciate you coming on and spending a lot of obvious thought and cordial discussion on these topics, and being open to correction and correcting me. So I just wanted to thank you. And basically, the main thrust of my argument has been that the goodness that is the highest good is real, and that there is a universality to that for all peoples, and that's what it means to be good with God, is to be in accord with that and to participate in the nature that God has created, and that's sort of what unifies all these aspects of human understanding and human ethics.
Thank you. I have enjoyed coming on. I think you guys have been very good hosts, and I sincerely appreciate it. It was very nice finally meeting you, and I certainly also very much enjoyed the discussion, which I found stimulating and challenging in all the places that it should have been. So thank you very much for that. I hope you're sitting down. I disagree with you. Still there? You didn't fall over?
Yep.
Okay.
I am sitting down, though.
It was a shock. It was a shock. I know. I disagree with you. But reasonably. No, my view is that, evolution doesn't explain, it doesn't provide us with a normative ethical framework, but it does provide us with this intuition that we use. And with this intuition, we've been constantly trying to hone in on better and better frameworks, better being described by any number of ways, but really ones that we ourselves feel satisfied with. And sometimes we do better, sometimes we do worse, and sometimes we revisit. It's an ongoing thing. I would very much like there to be an objective one. I think that would make life a lot easier. Doesn't mean it's there, and I don't see either any evidence that it's there, or that there'd be any reasonable demonstration that it's there versus the systems that we have. Actually, I just repeated myself. And I think that when we take a look at the religious systems, they're actually just normative systems. They claim to be meta-ethical, but they're bound by all of the problems that all normative systems are bound by. And I don't see any real getting around that. Therefore, when we talk about can you be good with God, I think the answer is sort of we all end up finding a way. But again, it was a very pleasant discussion, and thank you very much for your time, and thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And good night, everyone. God bless, or in a more secular language, may that which grounds your existence do the very best for you.
I like it. I'm going to use that one.
Yes. And we will see you all later. Bye for now.